I would now like to introduce today's speakers. It is a real privilege to be joined by the Assistant Minister for Citizenship, Customs and Multicultural Affairs, as well as the Assistant Minister for International Education, the Honourable Julian Hill MP. Welcome today, Julian.
Great to be with you, and hello to everyone right around the country. I'm here in Parliament just having finished a surprise hour of Parliament this morning on a Friday, passing the last bills. So good to be with you.
Wonderful. And thank you for joining us. And I'm also joined today by Sushrut Kulkarni, is a chartered civil and environmental engineer and project manager for Osmoflo. Sushrut came to Australia as an international student more than a decade ago. Welcome today, Sushrut.
Be here, Tim, and hello to everyone online.
So I would really now like to invite the Assistant Minister to make some opening remarks and help us frame today's discussion. Thank you, Assistant Minister.
Thanks so much, Tim, and great to be joining you also, Sushrut, and to everyone right around the country. Many years ago, when I used to attend CEDA lunches, it was always sort of the rubber chicken routine. So I'm sorry, in a sense, we can't physically get together, but this format does allow more people to participate in a discussion. Perhaps a Christmas gift. I got the draft program last week and they had me talking for 10 minutes and I said, no, let's make it 5 and we'll have more of a conversation. So I'll try and frame some thoughts. International education is a great Australian success story. It's a sector that I first got to know and fell in love with when working under a Liberal government in the state of Victoria as a public servant. It's our biggest services export sector, our 4th biggest export sector overall for the country, worth more than $51 billion of export income, supporting more than 250,000 Australian jobs. It provides us with some of the best, highly valued, most economically productive skilled migrants that our country gains and benefits from. But this focus on the economy, which is an important part of the story, can often distract from the fact that international education, first and foremost, is about people. It's about people like Sushrut who choose to come to Australia, and it is a choice, and education, of course, to change lives. We are thankful and grateful, or most Australians are, perhaps not all, thankful and grateful when people do choose to come as young people and spend at least a few years living in our society. The Foreign Affairs folks rightly talk about the soft power that Australia has built, particularly in Southeast Asia, but increasingly now across the world, from having so many millions of people come to our country, spend a bit of time, and we hope have a good experience and take that little bit of Australia home with them for the rest of their lives and become a bridge between our two societies. Happy to talk further, but one of the things I've been thinking about is how we recognise that international education is increasingly more than just a services export. It is part of our national statecraft. It is an enabler of the other traditional pillars of foreign affairs, our statecraft, foreign affairs, defence, trade and aid, but also part of Brand Australia in its own right. But success is not guaranteed. We are a premium destination. We have, compared to other competitor nations at times, significant visa fees. We've always had a high visa fee. We have, relatively high cost of living for many students in Australia. And we also have growing competition where traditional source countries are increasingly becoming destination environments. Success, in the government's view, requires a ruthless focus on quality, on integrity, on a great student experience, and also that social licence, the political dimension, if you like, that Australians continue to support this sector. There's a lot of urban myths out there which drive me nuts, that international students take our kids' places at unis. Quite the opposite. They support and fund our kids' classrooms and research infrastructure and so on. It has been a tough few years for universities as well as non-university private providers, TAFEs and so on. With COVID, with the borders home, I'll try not to make this too partisan, but, Tony Abbott was all right on it. Turnbull was great. Morrison, I think, was dreadful. He literally told the students to go home. I would have hoped that if my daughter or your kids were in another country studying during a global pandemic, that they got treated a bit better than some of these young people got treated in Australia. Meanwhile, the lobsters got their own plane. But we did see growth returning strongly, and that's a good thing. But when we came to government, there was unsustainable patterns of growth as well as integrity issues, including in Christine Nixon's review. That's led to tough decisions, including tightening up the visa integrity settings, raising some of the visa fees to reduce speculative applications, as well as the national planning level. Growth has moderated, which has allowed the government to increase the national planning level for next year by around 9%, with public uni allocations, though, assessed against a framework of new student housing, Southeast Asian engagement and market diversification. I'll just finish on these couple of points. We have not pursued in this term a hard cap on providers, but we are in a managed growth environment. And if anyone thinks the government will just give up on managing onshore student numbers, frankly, they've got rocks in their head. This is a wonderful sector for Australia. These are great human beings, young people, but it is the only sector where every customer who comes needs a house or a bedroom to live in for some years. One of the consequences of managed growth, which we can talk about, is pursuit of more transnational education, exporting Australian education to the world. And I'm heading to India, then Sri Lanka on Wednesday with Minister Clare and Minister Giles for a few days to keep promoting more that we can do offshore. Very pleased this morning in the House, as well as the once-in-a-generation environmental law reforms, the Parliament also passed the Education Integrity Bill, which was returned from the Senate. We have ongoing work to do on student visa settings, and we'll be preparing and releasing a new strategic framework in next year that we'll invite people's input into. So I think that's 5 minutes. It helps frame the discussion, Tim, but very happy to take the chat wherever people would like it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Assistant Minister, and congratulations on the passing of the Integrity Bill. That's fantastic news. And thank you for those insightful comments. And I really, it resonated with me a lot, that bringing it back to that human-centric and, the experience that international students are having when they come here, and how important that is. And you mentioned integrity and quality a few times there. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I would also then like to invite Sushrut to also make some opening comments. So I'd be very interested to hear your experiences there, Sushrut.
Well, thank you, Tim. So going off from what the minister has alluded to, when I moved to Australia in 2013, the experiences that allowed me to make this decision to move to an overseas country from my home base still exist, and that shows in why Australia is such a destination for people wanting to come here to study, the quality of education that's on offer, the global standing that we have, and as Australia, as an education provider, has been very strong in this global changing landscape at this moment. I think all of these reasons that were the main reasons why I moved to Australia, and I think they still hold true at the moment. Obviously, there have been some challenges, experience that I've shared or seen through my journey here, and I'm keen to talk about it with the forum and assist in sharing what I've gone through, what I've seen, and why I've made the decision to move to Australia, why it's paid off, and why I'm one of the very happy recipients of an Australian education that's been a real benefit to my career and my professional growth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sushrut. And yeah, I mean, as you say, that reputation that Australia has for quality education is critically important. And it's not by accident that the sector is such an important part of the economy as well. So thank you for those insights. And look, I'm looking forward to unpacking a little bit of that as we go. Maybe, Assistant Minister, if I could kick off with first of all, maybe I'll just let everybody know. Pigeonhole, as I've mentioned, please log into that. You can vote for some of the questions in there as well, so that we can prioritize those that are getting a lot of the sort of, popularity. And a lot of people will be thinking very similar things. So please feel free to do that, and we can then sort of prioritize the ones that are most on people's minds first. But why don't I kick off, Assistant Minister, and just ask about the national planning level for 2026, and it makes reference to an updated ministerial direction. Would you be able to maybe please explain for us the sort of how that differs from the current ministerial direction 111, and how that is intended to interact and support the planning level going forward?
Sure. So as I said in the introductory remarks, the national planning level is not a cap. It's a planning level to help guide providers to work with the government to manage the onshore student numbers, to allocate notional new overseas student commencements. It's called a NOSC. It's another acronym, but allocate the number of new commencing students by provider. The ministerial direction, so I sit in both departments. I'm a minister in the Home Affairs Department, but also the Education Department. So the ministerial direction is a thing that's issued under the migration portfolio that directs the Home Affairs Department staff in how they prioritise assessing student visas. So it's a prioritisation mechanism, not a cap. The way that direction works, the new direction, it's now got 3 prioritisation levels. So for providers, whether that's universities or private providers who are recruiting students, if they're up to 80% of their new student commencement planning level, then they'll receive the highest priority processing. The time expected will vary depending on the overall caseload, but at the moment that should be within about 4 weeks, thereabouts. If they're between 80% and 115%, so, a little bit over, a little bit under the planning level, the commencement level, then they will receive standard priority processing, which at the moment, I think between about 4 and 8 weeks. Don't hold me to that. I'll encourage you to go and look at the website because it's a dynamic system. As the caseloads increase, at times may slow down a little bit, or quid pro quo, it may speed up a bit. If a provider is then over 115% of their proposed commencement level that they've been allocated, the planning level, then they'll receive slower processing. Visa applications will continue to be processed, but we won't guarantee that they'll proceed as quickly. Part of the philosophy is really to spread the visa processing resources equitably amongst providers, allow providers to plan with greater certainty for their operations and for student recruitment, and make sure that everyone gets kind of, a lick of the ice cream and a fair go at the visa processing resources. The differences between the previous ministerial direction, the one that I signed a couple of weeks ago, are probably 3 things. One is the introduction of that slower processing lane. The second is some additional policy exemptions from the commencement numbers where they'll continue to receive faster visa processing. So secondary school students onshore articulating, closing providers, a few pretty common sense exemptions. And then the third is a bundling, pooling mechanism for small vet providers to give them a fairer go at the visa processing system. And they're often newer providers as well for market entrance.
Fantastic.
Very technical, but there'll be a few nerdy folks on the line.
Absolutely, there always are, and I'm a fellow nerd, so I do appreciate the detail. Sushrut, if I could ask you, you sort of mentioned in your opening remarks the sort of process that you went through in your decision making to move to Australia, and I'd really be interested to if you could unpack that a little bit. What originally drew your attention to Australia, as opposed to other possible destinations you could head for international education?
Sure. I think one of the biggest decisions that I had to make, Tim, was obviously moving from my home country to a new country I've known nothing about to essentially try and get an education here. The ease of application in terms of how streamlined the processes are, the strong relationships the Australian government has with international education providers that are located overseas as well, really assisted me in making that decision that, all right, this is a place that actually wants me to come here and study, and they actually are willing to facilitate the administrative hurdles that need to be overcome in terms of application on navigating that space, so making sure that the courses which I'm choosing are the right fit for me. Also coming from an education system which is slightly different to what we have here in Australia, just understanding how that compares against what the Australian university entry requirements are and what the Australian universities are looking for. I think that process was very straightforward and easy to understand, and it left very little for me to have to navigate on myself. That was one of the major drivers. And also in terms of the meritocratic intake of the universities that we have here, just purely based on what my academic performances were in the past, and if I'm going to be a fit for the courses that I'm intending to take, made sure that I was set up from success right from the get-go. But I was sure that when I'm entering into a course, I do have the capability to make sure that it's a successful outcome for me at the end. So those 2 reasons were the main intellectual reasons as to why I was applying for it. And also on a side note, with Australia being one of the stable economies, stable countries in this world, and what we have to offer in terms of a day-to-day lifestyle, the way of life that we say in Australia, that was something very, very attractive for myself. And I think all of these factors combined together resulted in an amalgam of my decision to, yep, this is the place I'd like to go and study further and see where that takes me.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you, Sushrut. And you sort of mentioned your commitment to making sure that you were going to really follow through and really put everything into the study that you were going to undertake in Australia. And it sort of goes back to the comment the Assistant Minister made around ensuring that there is that positive experience and those mechanisms that we have for actually ensuring that we don't have the latent, I guess, the spurious sort of applications or speculative, I think you said, Assistant Minister, apologies. Look, I think in that context, one of the questions I have for you, Assistant Minister, is around the planning level. And you mentioned the framework, but in particular, what are some of the really key critical considerations the government takes into account when setting that level? And how do you balance some of those, I guess, different stakeholder demands and views when you're doing this?
The primary overarching consideration is sustainable growth. You start from the existing status quo, and that's important because people can argue whether it's a good or a bad thing, but it's a reality for a very long time that our public universities, that a lot of their capital, that a lot of the research is in significant part supported through international students. I think we haven't always reflected, maybe it's a bit of boiled frog, but over the last 20 years, most of our public universities have actually become globalised institutions. They're quite incredible outfits. Their primary function, first and foremost, is to teach Australian students, and certainly the Universities Accord has refocused on that. They also have a critical role in research, whether that's basic research or applied research, to boost the economy, to create new knowledge, the traditional functions of universities. But they are also globalised institutions. And you start from the status quo because shocks would massively shock our university system for little public good. And similarly for private providers where people have in good faith invested capital and complied with regulatory obligations and so on. So one of the big things we've tried to do has been to improve stability and certainty in policy. This is a sector, for those of us who've been around for a while or may have seen it over some decades, that at times has been characterised by unhelpful shocks, whether that's market shocks or government policy shocks. There's a lot of ups and downs. We saw the bubble in the late 2000s, and we were very concerned that we saw a new bubble emerging post-COVID. That was driven in part by strong global demand rebounding faster than anticipated, but also some really appalling policy settings which the Morrison government put in place, including uncapped student work hours to allow students onshore to work as many hours as they want. That attracted a flood of non-genuine students who are frankly still hanging around in the country today, bouncing through the tribunal and courts appeals system. It's hard to get rid of anyone from Australia. Not impossible, but it takes a lot of time and resource because we're a very fair country and we comply by the Refugee Convention and so on. And there's a lot of gaming of the system that people try and engage in if you let in the wrong students or the wrong people. So, as I said, growth has moderated. Commencements were down by about 15% last year. Last financial year, visa applications were down by, I think, around 26%. So that gave us the headroom to give a bit of a bump and resolve a few of those policy issues. The other observation, though, that I'd make is around housing, just to really re-emphasise that point. And I'll just finish on this point, Tim. You sort of mentioned that we get different conflicting stakeholder views. That's true. Every state government, I think, writes to us or tells us they want more students. Just about every institution or provider says, but we'd like more students. But we do need the sector to confront the realities of housing. I'm not blaming students for Australia's failure for a generation to build enough houses. Never have, never will. But as I say in every forum, aggregate demand, the overall levels do have an impact on housing. We want students to be able to come and be accommodated sensibly and in a proper way. But we need Australians also to feel that we're not welcoming too many students that then place pressures on services and infrastructure. So there's some of the key things. But I think about it as that modest, sustainable growth and using our policy settings increasingly to incentivise and link new growth to new housing.
Thank you, Assistant Minister. And housing is obviously a very big issue that we need to unpack. And Sushrut, I might ask you. Obviously, it's a very different time, and this is a catalyst for a lot of the kind of discussion that's been going on. But your experience in 2013 when you arrived in Australia, did you have big challenges in terms of accommodation? What were some of the other challenges that you really faced when you were moving out here, and maybe any advice that you might give to international students looking to do the sort of same things today, and again recognizing that the different times?
Absolutely. 2013 was a very different time to come, and as compared to now, as you can imagine. See, the main challenges that I had, Tim, was obviously when I moved to Australia, there was accommodation that was provided by the universities as part of their standard services that they provide. But that was a limited section for a very small cross-section of the students that did decide to move here. And again, I understand that the universities can't cater to everyone that is moving here. But the biggest challenge I had was trying to navigate that space in terms of finding accommodation for myself. So coming to Australia, day one, we obviously did not have any accommodation sorted. So it was temporary accommodation, and then trying to find where, like maybe applications to rental units and so on and so forth. Again, keeping in mind that 2013 was a very different landscape as to today. I count myself rather lucky that I did come at that time, which allowed me to get a reasonable accommodation that could fit in with my requirements and my financial constraints. I was very happy to secure it, and that's a big part in where I am today. So in hindsight, I would say this accommodation for students is highly critical because it gives them a stable base from which they can go about their education and actually start planning for how they're going to get their degrees across the line. The advice I'd like to give to students coming here now is making sure that before you come here, you have some idea of what sort of a environment you will be entering into, and having a plan in place on how you want to navigate it. There's nothing as stressful, I would say, is coming to a new country and you're having to start from very scratch about where am I going to sleep tonight. That is something that I would definitely advise, that have a plan in place. There's excellent resources within the universities that you can reach out to. There's peers that have already been here. Make sure you have that network agreed with, and to give yourself that buffer that you can make the best choice for yourself so that you are in a good spot to succeed from day one.
Wonderful. That is great advice. And critical importance for student accommodation. And Assistant Minister, you've mentioned about opportunities around things like homestay and building more student accommodation as well. And as you mentioned, as part of the framework for the national planning, could you comment on how we might support some of these initiatives and what the role might be for education providers, governments, and households in making opportunities come to fruition?
I'm so glad you asked that. I didn't even set you up to ask that, but I'm really glad you asked that. Just on the issue of homestay, look, this is not a magic bullet, but I do think it's an area where we used to do better at as a country, that we can make a bit of a contribution, particularly in regional areas or where institutions have the opportunity to engage with their local community. I'll give you an example. There was a Host for the Coast program run by the Gold Coast City Council up around the Gold Coast. Most Australians don't know, but spread it, that the tax office, there's an explicit ruling that allows people to host 2 international students in their house to keep the board and lodgings and rent as tax-free income. So, there are spare bedrooms around. Some of the advantages of that, as long as we obviously, there's homestay sort of host providers, not-for-profits or for-profits that institutions can engage. Whilst the young people in that sense are adults, we're not talking about secondary students where there's a much stricter, obviously, set of regulatory arrangements for child safety. The host institutions can use intermediaries to make sure that the hosting experience is appropriate. and that we're not inadvertently directing young adults towards houses that perhaps they shouldn't be living in. But overwhelmingly, that's not an issue. I just acknowledge that. But I think there's more we could do, because it gives the international student a really different experience of Australian life by getting them involved, often in staying with a family, using a spare room, or indeed a retired person who might be a bit lonely, who might need a bit of extra cash, who might have a spare room. The anecdotal feedback we've had is that students may not stay there for their whole study, but it's a terrific way to do what Sushrut suggested there, which is get you started off for your first year in Australia and get you a bit more connected with the Australian community, builds better soft power, builds lifelong friendships, a bit more money in the pocket. The other thing I'd just note, the purpose-built student accommodation sector is a very fast-growing part of the residential market. Most of that at the moment is funded weirdly through foreign capital. There's some work that we're trying to do to have a look at why that is, but it is a discrete asset class we've got because of the government's policy settings. In part, there was some data came out last week from the Property Council. That's starting to build a good pipeline. I think it's 11 or 12,000 beds under construction, another amount that have planning permits, I think about 13, 14,000, and there's about 15, 16,000 in the planning application process. So what we're trying to do is create a virtuous cycle where incentivising institutions and to link future growth to student housing can stimulate that investment. So some of the universities obviously have the balance sheets and the capital to be able to invest in that themselves and make that choice. Others will partner with student accommodation providers for nomination rights, their commercial arrangements, but we do need to see more housing.
Absolutely. And Assistant Minister, you touched on the regional aspect. There's a question here around, are there plans to create more structured pathways for students going into regional areas where there are some of these chronic labour shortages?
Yes, it's a goal of policy. It's not easy. It's not hard. It's not, not straightforward. It's always been hard because the preferences, let's be honest, of most young people, this is just a personal choice issue. The choice that many young people are looking for, or most, is an experience in a big city. That's just life. But what I'd point out is a few things. When we look at the quality of the experience that students have in regional areas, it so often actually outstrips the experience in metropolitan areas. So there's a really great story there that we need to keep telling, that the opportunity to get involved in a regional town, to get to know people, to get part-time work, often you've got a much better chance of getting work in your field of study and interest because those areas, as you alluded to, Tim, may have regional labour market shortages. We see that in the annual student experience survey data. So there's a good story to tell for regional Australia. The policy settings also around allocating parts of the national planning level and the commencements have very much supported regional institutions, and we saw that in the 2026 allocations. The other lever that we have, one of the most powerful levers, particularly for students from countries that may have a greater likelihood of seeking a long-term migration outcome. There's nothing wrong with that. Although as a country, we need to be honest with students that most students need to go home. We've never made a promise as a country that everyone gets to stay. It's a function of mathematics. Most students will have to go home. But those who are seeking a migration outcome look very closely at the settings, and students in certain regional areas actually get an extra year of post-study work rights, which can be a powerful incentive for them to choose to study in a regional area. So there's a huge amount that regional Australia has to offer, but we can't force students, they're not bonded slaves, to go to particular regions. We do that through incentives and telling the great story of regional Australia.
Thank you, Assistant Minister. And you mentioned the challenges potentially for entering the workforce, in particular in regional Australia and the incentives there. But I'd be interested in, Sushrut, in your experiences when you were trying to enter the Australian workforce. What were some of the challenges and barriers that you might have encountered when you did that? And were there sort of things that institutions or governments could be thinking about to help support similar sorts of international students looking to transition into the workforce?
Sure. I think when I did come to Australia, one of the challenges we had, obviously, during my degree was finding the right employer that was willing to work with the hours that are allocated for an international student to work in. And often the gap was the expected requirements of the jobs that were on offer were very different to what we could actually be allowed to do under the visa. So in terms of work rights, I think as an international student, the primary aim is that we are here to study. It's getting a degree, and this part-time work that we're doing is just as a means to essentially get a little bit of funding for yourself to sustain yourself here. And once that mindset shift has happened, it's been had allowed me to apply to those kind of jobs with work as a secondary focus, the primary focus being getting a quality education. So that was one of the challenges, that was a mindset shift that needed to happen. That happened, and I think that was really helpful. And also, like the minister alluded to, assistant minister alluded to, is how I came to work in study in a regional area, and the work opportunities that we had available to us here were much more than a big metro city would offer. And that did allow me to essentially hold down a part-time job within my work entitlements as a student throughout the course of my degree and gain valuable experience, as well as making new connections into the Australian community. Because that was one key gap that I had when I moved. I didn't know anybody here. And having the chance to meet new people on a daily basis, forge those connections, that allowed me to not just essentially develop myself as an individual, because I was pretty young when I came here, but to also try to get into the way of how Australia operates as a country, as a society. And that has been a really, really good help to me to where I am at my current stage in my life.
Can I just add a comment there, Tim?
Absolutely.
I mean, what Sushrut just said then about your experience, right, is like, that's really lovely. And it's important that we as Australians reflect on that. There's a level of courage and entrepreneurial drive that so many young students choose to make. It's no easy thing. It's not something I've ever done, to up yourself at an early stage of life and move to a country where you may know no one or very few people, where you or your family may make enormous sacrifices financially to gather the money. It costs a lot of money if you're coming from certain countries, given exchange rates and so on. There's this myth that international students are all rich. That's just not the case. So many people really have an enormous drive to relocate and have a crack. Many people don't know whether they want to stay. They have no idea what they're walking into, but they want to, as you said, pursue a quality education and have a different experience at life. So there is a lot of courage. One of the things that makes me sad as an Australian at times is when you look at the data, and there is a percentage of students who come here not intending to migrate, but when they leave, one of the things that too many people say is, I never really felt like I made friends with an Australian or connected with the Australian community. So that experience that you've described and that we were talking about in regional areas, often in the smaller institutions that may have a lower percentage, there's some students that just seem to want to chase a small number of unis with a top global ranking. I really encourage students, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, they have wonderful faculties and world-class research and all that. But all of our high-quality, highly regulated, accredited Australian institutions have a lot to offer. And I really encourage students to think outside the square and look at those opportunities in regional Australia or other institutions where they may get a lot more of what they're looking for.
Absolutely. So, Sushrut, if I could start with you and Assistant Minister, I might also come back to you with this one as well. I'm wondering, from your experience, Sushrut, did you have any challenges applying the sort of learnings and education that you received here. And what I mean by that is often we have challenges recognizing past experience in the labour market. Was that a constraint for you, given that you'd studied here, or is it that wasn't something that you came up against as a challenge?
That's a very valid question, Tim, because I recognize that people or prospective students choose to move here at different stages of their life. I was fortunate that when I moved here as a bachelor's student. So I pretty much started off my education here, followed by my work experience. But I do recognize the fact that there will be significant prior learnings or experience that individuals might have when move here for higher studies. I think in my working experience, ever since I've graduated, there's the big cohort of individuals with a lot of experience that they are willing to contribute to the Australian economy and society. And they just have to go through the process of getting that recognized. And I think there is a massive potential that we as a country are sitting on, that we should be very helpful for us to progress, fill in those gaps that you mentioned, Assistant Minister, as well as those opportunities that we have with the cohort of talented and skilled individuals that are coming in, and maybe they choose to stay further, and that's what will benefit us really.
Wonderful. Assistant Minister, in that context and in that vein, is there any thinking around how we might help increase employer understanding, industry understanding, and uptake of some of the past experience and skills that international students and migrants are bringing?
Yeah, it's an important question, and there's many different ways to think about it. One is the actual policy settings. The strongest single predictive factor and there's many, but the strongest consistent predictive factor for success in the Australian labour market is good quality English. That's why one of the actions that the government took last term was to raise the English language requirement for the student visas from 5.5 to 6. It varies depending on where they're at in commencement. People can do preparation English language or pathway colleges, but to raise the standard of commencement. And then also to raise the standard of English for the temporary graduate visa. Embarrassingly, there's a small number of students, no one really knows how many, but it happens, where actually for some students their English gets worse in their time in Australia. Because when they were in their home country, they were studying English formally multiple times a week, they were practicing English, they were getting ready for their visa tests and so on. And for some students who come here and might study a science kind of discipline or something where they're not necessarily using a wide vocabulary, and then they make bad choices in the sense that they choose to live in a household and speak their first language most of the time. They choose to work in a restaurant or an environment and speak their first language most of the time. Actually, they're using English less than they did when they were practicing it. So that is one of the reasons that we raise the English language standards for graduates, because it helps them succeed and gives a positive incentive. On the employer side, it is competitive. And again, what I said, it's a function of mathematics, that not everyone will be able to secure graduate work or work in their chosen field. It is competitive. We do want the best students to continue to choose Australia, and we do have to give them a good student experience, a quality experience when they're here, both inside the classroom but also outside the classroom. International students, above all else, make this investment because they want their study to prepare them for, or ideally lead them to, a relevant job, whether they have a clear dream or a field that they wanted to explore. And so work-integrated learning and strong links with in-demand industries are important. There is work that we've done and continue to do and the states and territories often do some of this work with professional bodies, with peak bodies like Engineers Australia, like the Computer Society and so on, to remind employers that just because someone has a temporary visa, a 2-year graduate visa, they have full work rights. The employer is able to access employer-sponsored visa pathways afterwards. We have a shortage of engineers, for example, in Australia. We have a wealth of graduating engineers with good English. And so we do need employers to kind of take that chance on an international student, because more often, it does work out well. So there's a range of things we're kind of looking at. Happy to talk further, but we can keep it as a conversation.
Can I make a comment on that, Tim, if that's all right? So I think
Absolutely.
you made a very important point there, Assistant Minister, because it's almost an outreach program for the employers as well, that it's okay to give them a go because they do have the work rights. And I think when in my experience, there was a clear gap there, that if someone's a temporary graduate, they don't have restricted work rights. They can actually work as a normal employee would. And I think when I was applying to jobs, I found myself almost qualified for applying for a lot of jobs because the requirement was you need to be a resident or a citizen they need to have full work rights. So that's a very important point you've made there.
Yeah, it is. And look, it's a tricky thing. I've had feedback from employers. I have explored this issue on and off over the years in different roles. Some employers say, look, a graduate, when we take them on, needs 2 or 3 years to really train them up and, get them past the point they're losing us money and start being profitable for our business. If someone's only got 2 years work rights, that's a problem. So we do need to keep educating employers about the other pathways and employer-sponsored options, which are there and accessible. There's also an interesting set of questions and ideas, and there may be people on the call who have ideas they want to feed in. We're very pleased to hear them. Some people have suggested that we can restructure the temporary graduate visa a bit to better incentivise people in certain study areas that can make a better contribution. Others have made suggestions that we could restructure some of the broader incentives about skilled migration, but it varies. And at the end of the day, I say very clearly to students and to the Australian public that the government will always operate the migration system in our national interest. And there is no guarantee to anyone who comes to Australia they'll ever get permanent migration. And we do change the migration settings from time to time. The skills shortage lists change, the visa settings change. So we can't guarantee that the same settings today remain there next year or the year after. It's a dynamic system.
Assistant Minister, you sort of touched on in-demand industries and, mentioning we structure a migration system for national interest. In that context, obviously a lot of the skill shortage that we're seeing at the moment in the labour market are coming from vocational and training sort of side of the tertiary sector. Is there any thinking around how Australia can promote vocational education and TAFEs as an equally sort of attractive option as universities for international students?
Yeah, absolutely. And TAFEs have been decimated in the international onshore market, to be blunt. They're now about 3% of the market share, which is not a great situation. A lot of that, unfortunately, has been driven by the disreputable behaviour at the bottom end of the private vocational training sector. We need to be careful and not tar everyone with the same brush. There's some really terrific private training businesses that have found a market niche that deliver good quality product, that have relationships with employers, that have been operating for years or decades, meet all the regulatory standards. But the feedback I've had over the last 2 to 3 years is that it's become really tough for them. That's why the passing of the integrity bill this morning in the Parliament, as I said, it came back from the Senate. We accepted the amendments, negotiated in good faith with the opposition. But the passing of that bill is really important for reputable providers. It will give us the power with a new definition for onshore, for agent commissions and education agent to take tougher action to wipe out commissions for onshore student transfers. There's really predatory behaviour emerging. A lot of the people on the call, to draw an analogy, lots of markets operate with intermediaries, whether it's life insurance or pharmaceutical companies, financial advisors, mortgage brokers, whatever. And over the last few decades, at times in many other sectors, the intermediaries corrupt the market. We saw that when I was growing up, and there was all the drug company reps that were caught giving doctors kickbacks and free TVs and holidays for recommending certain drugs. You've got to wipe that stuff out. We had a Royal Commission where we looked at the behaviour of mortgage brokers and how that needed to be regulated, insurance, transparency and commissions and so on. So there are things that we're going to need to do to improve integrity. Jobs and Skills Australia's work, back onto your core point though about vocational, showed that international student graduates in areas of skills shortage have really good vocational employment outcomes, actually better than higher education graduates, in that first phase, more likely to jump into their area of expertise. And I'll finish on this point. I touched on it at my speech at the International Ed Association annual conference last month. I'll use the animal analogy. The higher education market is characterised by a bunch of elephants, large providers, universities, with a few cats and dogs and a few mice. The vocational training market onshore is characterised by pretty much no elephants anymore, a few cats and dogs, and 1,000 or more mice. It's a very peculiar market structure in terms of efficiency for delivery or having any ability to scale up and deliver Australian vocational education and training offshore in the countries that are actually seeking it. We also have never really had a policy framework as a country that for the vocational onshore market. Now, I have no secret plan, there's no grand plan, but it's a conversation which many have said we should have in an era of managed growth. Do we want to work with the vocational and training sector to think what's in the country's national interest? Can this sector play a greater role to helping Australia fill our skills needs in areas of priority? So it's an interesting question, and it's one that we should be continuing to think about. How do we extract the most value in every possible sense, both for the people who choose to come here, but also for our nation?
While we're on that, Assistant Minister, we do have a number of questions that are coming through around that sort of positioning ourselves to really attract that global talent. I was very curious to understand, how we're doing to position ourselves against other sort of competitor nations with international education and big international education sectors. As a sort of corollary to that, how do you see the impact of the national planning level also impacting in that sort of a competitive market?
Very positively is the short answer. We have a peculiar moment, if you want to look globally, where for a long time now there's been the big Anglosphere, frankly, traditional source country, destination countries, where a lot of students globally have been seeking a premium English language education experience. That's been in Australia, in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand. What we're seeing, though, is a shift towards a more multipolar system where other category is growing quite rapidly. We've seen, for example, Singapore, now Dubai and the UAE, Germany, Japan, South Korea have expressed intentions. I'm just illustrating a few, right? There's many others are seeking to welcome international students, including some countries providing English language tuition experience in a country where English is not the first or an official language. So it's a more competitive global landscape. You've also seen, though, for a range of policy and political reasons, our big traditional competitors change policy settings or rhetoric that have made it harder for students to go there or made them feel less welcome, whether that's with Canada with caps, with the US with changes in migration settings and policies from the administration, or indeed the UK. So that has created opportunities for Australia to seek to attract some more of the best and the brightest students. It's also created pressures for demand where students who are purely seeking a migration pathway may be able to go elsewhere. It's going to put more pressure on applications to Australia, and we're going to have to maintain our integrity standards. Been very clear with the department as a government. I'm not going to sit around as a minister, nor will Jay Sinclair or Tony Burke, nor will the government, with popcorn and watch the same movie unfold like the previous government did for 2 years and create a bubble of dodgy students. We will act, and I reserve the right to change the evidence levels and integrity settings whenever they're needed and out of cycle, if you like. So there's a lot of opportunity globally for us, but we may need to maintain our integrity settings.
Thank you, Assistant Minister. Sushrut, if I could ask you, given that you have the ear of the Assistant Minister at the moment and a large contingent around this call, what would you really like everybody to understand about the lived reality of students navigating visas, jobs, life in Australia, some of those challenges, and any advice that you could then pass on to future international students as they try and navigate the same challenges?
The big question, Tim. Uh, I think in terms of breaking it down to smaller sections, going from the end, the advice to international students that think of moving here would be you are thinking of moving to a place which offers you a true quality meritocratic education, which only with the only limits on how far you progress or how well you do are depend on what sort of effort and what sort of capability you are bringing to the table. It's completely dependent on how you are approaching this education. You will go as far as you would go if you have the goods to back it up. In terms of navigating all of this fear, Assistant Minister, and if I could say, is as a student moving to Australia, about 18, 19, if you're moving here, you don't know your elbow from your hand pretty much at this point. So the ability to access the services that are required to make that transition in the first few months or first year or so of moving to Australia, that in my experience was critical to set us up for success. And I think the more support as that can be provided by university or government in that area to people moving here as students would be really beneficial. And that will make sure that we have the right people coming here who know they will be supported to make the right decisions to make sure that the best success story that they can be.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sushrut. And Assistant Minister, maybe in that sort of context, is there any thinking around, or do you see some value in really targeting the sort of high-performing international graduates as a means to really facilitate some of that greater integration going forward?
Yes, and I'll put it in context. One of the things as a government that we've been very focused on through the migration strategy, but also our ongoing reform work, and it's something I spoke about extensively in opposition, is really dialing back on this notion of permanently temporary migrants. Whether that's through the shameful reality for our country really of people who are genuine refugees but condemned to live life here insecurely for over a decade on temporary protection visas. I'm really proud as a government that we've given those people permanent protection and they're able often to see their kids for the first time in 10 years and actually reunite their family. Whether it's skilled migration and giving people who are working, skilled in Australia, making a contribution, following the law, no security risk, paying tax, pathways to permanent residency, whether it's treating New Zealanders fairly by giving them pathway to permanent residency when often they've lived in our country for 5, 10, 20 years, treating Kiwis as well as New Zealanders treated Australians for a long time. But that's also true of international students. And one of the phenomenons, which is not in our country's interest, it's not in our labour market's interest in terms of your core question there, Tim, about attracting and retaining the best and the brightest. And it's not in the interests of these young people at that time of their life, is to allow people to keep hopping from visa to visa to visa. So people may pursue, they may be a genuine student and come here and do their 1 year, 2 year, 3 year qualification. They may or may not be eligible for a temporary graduate visa of whatever length. But at the end of that, if they have a migration aspiration to Australia and they're not making the cut for skilled migration, which is competitive, then we cannot sustain them continuing to jump to another course, to a temporary graduate visa, to this visa, to that visa. At the end of the day, they need to go home. And it doesn't help when someone's been here for most of their adult life, from 20 to 30. We're much better off to incentivise and tighten the system so that people who do make the cut, who we do want, the highest performing graduates in the right areas, can get a permanent visa quicker, and that the other people, after they've had their time in Australia and come for their studies, go home. And that is a philosophy in the migration strategy, and one of the things we're still trying to deal with. We've tightened up, for example, the pathway from visitor visas to student visas onshore, and there's more we may need to look at because what we inherited from the former government really was a shocking mess, partly driven by those uncapped work hours, which I mentioned, and Sushrut touched on it himself. People come here to pursue a premium Australian quality education, and we can't see our high-quality student visa turned into some kind of low-rent work visa. We're not a guest worker society. That's not who we've been as a country. We've done well from good permanent skilled migration, and we need to make sure we're managing temporary migration appropriately.
Well, thank you, Assistant Minister. And as you say, when the time's up, we all have to go home. And unfortunately for us, that applies to this event. I'm sure we could stay here talking all day, but that has been an incredible insights. And thank you very much, Assistant Minister, for your candor, and Sushrut for sharing your experiences and your thoughts around the challenges and the opportunities in the sector. And what I've really heard is that we are really lucky, but it's through a lot of careful planning as well that we have created such an incredibly strong and diverse sector and of such high quality. I'm very, very heartened to hear that that quality is still front and foremost in the mind of the government. And again, congratulations on getting the integrity bill through and all approved. Again, thank you so much both for your time. It has been really great. And I'd also like to thank National Australia Bank again as well for their sponsorship for today and for the series. Just for everybody on the line, there will be an email that is sent out with the recording of today's discussion, but it'll be available on the CEDA website in probably approximately about a week. But until then, look, thank you everybody for your participation, and thank you both again.